She didn't destroy my company by accident. She planned it. Every move, every meeting, every handshake, all of it was pointed directly at me from the start. And the worst part, I still recognize her perfume the second she walked into the boardroom. 10 years later, and my brain just betrayed me like that. My name is Kai, and this is the story of how I lost everything to the one person I had spent my entire life trying to impress without ever admitting it. Let's go back, because none of this makes any sense without the beginning. And the beginning starts in a classroom that smelled like chalk and bad decisions. I was 11 years old the day I met Mia Chen. She sat next to me in math class and solved a problem on the board that our teacher had called extra. Credit for adults. She didn't even look proud about it. She sat back down, opened her notebook, and started doodling in the margin. I stared at her for probably 30 full seconds straight. I was, at that exact moment, completely done for. 11 years old and already finished. My brain just said, "That's her. Okay. Search over. We're done here." We became inseparable after that. Study sessions, science fairs, late night calls arguing about theorems that nobody else our age even knew existed yet. She was smarter in some ways, faster with numbers, faster with patterns. But I was better with strategy and systems. Together we made our teachers mildly uncomfortable. We won regional competitions. We built a working water filtration prototype in 8th grade. A teacher submitted it to a national program. We were 14 years old. I never told her how I felt, obviously, because I was a genius who could solve differential equations but couldn't say 3 honest words. To a girl who trusted me completely. By 10th grade, she was the center of my world. Not dramatically, just in the quiet way where you notice everything about a person without meaning to notice at all. The way she tapped her pen when she was thinking through a problem. The way she argued, never cruel, always precise, always somehow correct in the end. The way she laughed like she had completely forgotten to be embarrassed about it, fully, without apology, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And then one Tuesday in October, I saw her in the hallway with a guy named Derek, holding hands. She was laughing at something he said with that exact same laugh. Derek was on the soccer team, grade solidly average. His most impressive intellectual achievement was probably knowing all the words to one popular song from that year. I stood there holding my calculus textbook and felt something crack quietly inside my chest. Not dramatically, no scene, just crack. And then I kept walking. She didn't owe me anything. I had never said one word to her about any of it. That was the most humiliating part. No right to feel what I felt, but I felt it anyway. I said nothing. I smiled when I saw them together in the halls. I helped her study for finals that semester. I told myself it was fine until I almost believed it. And then I took all of that, the cracked feeling, the silence, the embarrassment, and I turned every last bit of it into something I could actually use. Into fuel. Not healthy, probably. My therapist would later describe this life choice as emotionally avoidant behavior masked by high-performance compensation. I called it Tuesday. I worked like the world was ending every single day. Top grades, top university, full scholarship, internship at 20, first startup running by 22. Mia and I stayed in contact through college. Emails, mostly. She went into business, said she wanted to build something that would last longer than trends. We didn't see each other in person for years after graduation. That distance helped me. I could keep the feeling at arm's length and call it nostalgia instead of what it was. By 28, I had built a tech company that processed logistics for mid-sized manufacturing chains. Boring description, extraordinary margins, very different categories. My company, Ardent Systems, was moving $3 billion in annual revenue by my 30th birthday. $3 billion. I grew up eating dry cereal for dinner twice a week. My right hand through all of it was Gary Moss. 6'1", permanently skeptical, drinks too much coffee, and has told me this is a bad idea roughly 400 times. He was right about 380 of those times. The other 20 he was also right, but I didn't want to hear it in that particular moment, so I ignored him. Gary was the only person alive who knew the full story about Mia, not willingly shared, because he is completely relentless, and I had one vulnerable moment on a delayed flight in 2019. He brought it up every time her name appeared in any context whatsoever. Every single time, without fail, for years. In retrospect, it should have been a serious warning to me. I ran into her at an industry conference in Chicago, October, 7 years after graduation. She was presenting on sustainable supply chain structures for manufacturing investment. She looked exactly like herself. Same precision, same quiet intensity, same eyes that went sharp when they found something worth focusing on. I had not prepared for that. She had built Vertex Capital, an investment firm focused on the manufacturing and logistics sector, which was, I would later realize, not a coincidence at all. We had dinner that evening, caught up in the careful way where both people are saying real things while also not saying the actual real thing underneath all of it. She asked about Ardent. I told her the numbers. Her eyes did something I couldn't fully read, a quick flicker, recognition, or maybe something more like quiet calculation. I told Gary about the dinner the next morning. He put his coffee down, looked at me directly, and said, "She is going to be trouble." I told him to please relax. Gary was not relaxed. Gary is never relaxed, but especially not about this specific situation, and especially not about her specifically. The next 18 months were the best stretch of my career by a significant margin. Ardent expanded into Southeast Asia. We signed to major automotive manufacturer contracts. I was featured on the cover of a business quarterly. My mother called me 12 times in one day to tell everyone she had ever met in her entire life about it. My father sent a short email that just said "Good job, son," with absolutely no punctuation, and I sat at my desk staring at those four words for a full minute, feeling something large. And somewhere underneath all of it, in the back of my mind, where I thought it couldn't embarrass me, was one small and completely unreasonable thought I kept returning to. That someday she would see it. That she'd understand who I had become. That the guy she walked past in that hallway had turned into someone actually worth noticing. Not revenge. I wasn't the dramatic, or at least that is what I told myself. I just wanted her to see. That was all. Very healthy. Totally normal. Completely fine. It was a Thursday in March when Gary walked into my office without knocking and closed the door behind him with a careful quietness that made me stop what I was doing immediately. He put a document on my desk and stood back without a single word. A formal prospectus. The cover had a logo I recognized within about half a second of looking at it. Vertex Capital. Her company. Right there on my desk in a building I had put on her client list for months ago without thinking twice because I trusted her completely. I read it 3 times. Each time I finished, I went back to the beginning because I kept thinking I was misunderstanding something critical. I was not misunderstanding anything. Gary finally sat down. He said nothing for the full minutes. Then he said, "Remember when I said she was going to be trouble? That morning in Chicago after your dinner, Vertex Capital had quietly acquired our largest supplier without us ever noticing it happen. Then our second largest. Then 2 of our biggest distribution partners. Over 14 months. While I was signing automotive contracts and appearing on magazine covers and feeling genuinely successful, she had been building a financial structure around my company like a frame." Gary slid another document across the desk. A formal acquisition offer for Ardent Systems from Vertex Capital. The number was generous. That actually made it worse than a low offer would have. A low number I could have been cleanly angry about. A generous number just made me feel like a problem she had already finished calculating and was now offering to solve politely. I sat in my office for a long time after Gary left. The city looked exactly the same out the window. Traffic, lights, people moving. That seemed wrong. Everything should have shifted somehow. She hadn't just beaten me in business. She had walked around me like I was a piece on a board she had already thought past 12 moves ago, while smiling at me over dinner. I called her that evening. She picked up on the second ring like she had been expecting the call and had simply been waiting to see how long it would take me to make it. I asked her why. She said it was business. I said we were friends. There was a pause on her end that lasted long enough to carry a specific and deliberate meaning. Then she said something that shifted everything I thought I understood about the last decade, and the decade before it, and every decision I had made between the two. She said, "You really don't know what you did, do you?" Not a question. A statement, like she'd been waiting years to say it and was mildly disappointed the moment had finally arrived. I told her I genuinely had no idea what she was talking about. I meant it completely. I ran back through every memory I had of her and could not locate the thing she was describing. A longer pause came. I could hear her breathing and something underneath it that I couldn't name clearly, but recognized from a long time ago in the way you recognize an old sound. Then, "I'll see you at the negotiation." She ended the call before I could respond and left me holding a phone that had just stopped being useful to me in any meaningful way. Gary came in a few minutes later. He looked at my face and very carefully did not make any immediate comments, which from Gary meant he had registered the situation as genuinely serious. I told him she believed I had wronged her somehow, and had apparently been planning around the belief for over a year at minimum. He took that in without interrupting. Gary said she had been running a long-term operation for personal reasons, and was financially powerful enough to execute it without anyone noticing until it was already done. Then he asked very quietly whether I still had feelings for her. I told him that was completely irrelevant and we needed to focus on the business problem directly in front of us. He looked at me the way Gary looks at things when he is certain he is right, and equally certain that saying so will not accomplish anything useful in this particular moment. The negotiation was set for Monday. 4 days. For days to figure out what I had apparently done to someone I thought was my closest friend. Before years and distance got between us, Gary's recommendation was maximum legal response. Every lawyer we had on retainer, counter acquisitions on her smaller holdings, financial pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. I sat with that recommendation for 6 hours. I thought about everything Gary had laid out, and I thought about that pause on the phone and how she had said you really don't know. Not angry, not cold the way I would have expected from someone who had just cornered a competitor. Almost tired, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I thought about the girl who solved the board problem without looking proud, who laughed without apology, who had trusted me with every hard problem she ever worked through. I called Gary at 11 that night. He answered immediately because Gary does not actually sleep. He waits in a state of permanent low-level alertness for problems to require his attention. I told him I was not going to fight her. He said okay in the voice he uses when he is processing something he already dislikes before the full explanation has even started yet. I said I was going to remind her of who she actually was before the money and the strategy and the 14-month plan. I was going to remind both of us who we used to be. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said this was the worst idea I had ever had, including the time I presented a product live with a completely broken microphone for 11 minutes. I told him I knew it was a risk. He said he would be loudly and constantly opposed to every step of it. I said I knew that and was doing it anyway. He said, fine. What's the plan? That was Gary. For 100 times right, one time completely ignored by me. This was going to be for 101, and we both already knew it. Monday came. I walked into a building that Vertex Capital owned and sat across a table from the person who had spent a year quietly building a financial structure around mine. She looked at me the way you look at a document you have already finished reading and signed and filed. Completely composed, already past wherever I was sitting. I looked at her and thought, I do not know exactly what I am doing yet, but I am going to figure it out before anyone at this table stands up to leave. That much I was sure of. She opened the folder in front of her and laid out the documents with the same precision she had used to solve problems on a classroom board when we were both 11 years old. I said, before we start, I want the real answer. What did I do? Not the business version, not the legal framing. The actual answer to why we are sitting here right now. She looked up. Something moved fast behind her eyes. There and gone before I could name it, the way something moved just under the surface of still water before going quiet again. She said that was not what the meeting was scheduled for. I said I was aware of that and was asking anyway. The lawyers on both sides went very still and said absolutely nothing. She looked at me for a long moment. The room around us held expensive watches and prepared arguments, and people paid significant money to be ready for anything that might happen. Then she said 2 words. Like she had been keeping a door shut for years and had now opened it exactly 1 inch to see what I would do with the gap before closing it again. She said the quiet words and nothing else. You left. Like she had been saving them for exactly this moment and had finally decided to spend them. I said her name, and she said let's discuss the acquisition, and the door closed again. But she had not locked it. I had noticed that, and that was more than enough to begin with. Gary slid a notepad toward me under the edge of the table. 3 words in block letters, pressed so hard into the page that the pen had nearly gone through. Do not smile. I did not smile, but I wanted to, because for the first time since I had opened that prospectus, I was not looking at a business problem. I was looking at something I actually knew how to fix. Drop a comment. Do you think she still has real feelings for him underneath all of this, or is it purely revenge? Because that pause on the phone was doing a lot of heavy lifting. The negotiation lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of lawyers talking at each other in very expensive language while Mia and I sat at opposite ends of the same table saying almost nothing. That was the part nobody in the room understood. To people at the center of a 9-figure acquisition discussion, and neither of us was actually talking about the acquisition. She reviewed documents. I watched her review documents. Gary kicked me under the table twice, which I chose to interpret as moral support rather than a direct instruction to focus. By the end of the first hour, I had learned 3 things. 1. Her legal team was excellent. 2. She had prepared for every counter-argument we had brought. 3. She was avoiding my eyes. Not the way someone avoids the eyes of an opponent. The way someone avoids the eyes of a person they are not entirely sure they want to look at directly in this particular moment. That was information. I filed it carefully and said nothing about it and let the lawyers keep talking about terms I had already decided were not the real terms of anything happening in that room. At the 2-hour mark, one of her attorneys slid a revised offer across the table. Slightly better numbers, a structured transition period, generous retention packages for my senior team. Gary leaned toward me and said very quietly, "This is actually a reasonable offer." I told him I knew. He said, "So we're not taking it." I said, "Not today." He closed his eyes briefly. I pushed the revised offer back across the table. Not rejected, not tabled. There is a difference, and everyone in that room understood it, including Nia, who looked up for the first time in 40 minutes. I said I needed more time to review the full terms with my board. Standard language. Completely true. Also buying exactly the time I needed to figure out what I was actually going to do. She looked at me for about 3 seconds. Then she looked back down. Her attorney said they could extend the review window by 2 weeks. I said 2 weeks worked for us. Gary exhaled slowly. The meeting ended with handshakes and professional smiles and everyone putting papers into expensive bags. I watched Mia across the room talking to her assistant, calm. Organized, done. She did not say goodbye to me specifically. She said goodbye to the room. Her assistant held the door, and she walked through it without looking back, and that was the end of Monday. Gary and I stood in the elevator going down, and he did not say a single word for 11 floors. Then he said, 2 weeks. What exactly is the plan for 2 weeks? I said, I'm going to figure out what I did. He stared at the elevator doors. Then he said, you're going to investigate your own past like a case. I said yes. He said, sure, not find out, okay, doc. Gary has a specific way of saying okay that means the opposite of okay. But he has decided to let the situation develop rather than expend further energy on preventing it. That was that specific okay. The one I had learned to recognize after years of watching Gary disagree with me. I knew exactly what it meant. I had heard it roughly 40 times before. Always right before something I decided to do became significantly more complicated than I had anticipated. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about what she had said. You left. 2 words, simple, direct. Completely impossible for me to locate in any actual memory. I had never left Mia. We had drifted the way people drift after high school when life pulls everyone in different directions. I had not made a choice to leave. That was just what happened. Except, she had said it like it was a specific event. Like there was a date on it. Like I had done something deliberate that she had then spent 10 years thinking about and never forgotten. I pulled out my phone and I scrolled back through old emails. We had stayed in touch through college, the way I remembered. Sporadic but consistent. Real conversations, not just check-ins. And then I found it. Or rather, I found the absence of it. My last email to her was from March of our senior year of college. And there was no reply from her after that. But that wasn't the end of the thread. Before that email, there were 3 unanswered messages from her 3 over the course of 6 weeks. Emails I had apparently never responded to. I sat there staring at my phone screen. 6 weeks of silence from me, followed by 1 email I had sent as if nothing had happened, followed by nothing from her ever again. I opened those 3 emails. The first was a question about something we were both working on, normal. The second was a follow-up, lighter, slightly more careful, still normal. The third one was different, short. 6 sentences. She said she had something important to tell me. She said she wasn't sure how I would take it. She said she hoped we could talk. She said, I know this is probably going to change things between us, but I think I would rather say it than not say it and wonder for the rest of my life. I had never read that email. I had simply not opened it. I was in the middle of launching my first startup, working 20-hour days, running on 4 hours of sleep and bad coffee. She had been trying to tell me something that took courage to write, and I had left her on read for 6 weeks. Sent a casual follow-up email like those 3 messages didn't exist, and moved on. I put my phone down on the table and sat with that realization for a very long time, not moving, just letting it settle into the full shape of what it meant. Outside the window, the city moved through its regular evening, without knowing that someone at a kitchen table had just understood something. That changed the shape of 10 years. She hadn't just been hurt by me in the abstract way you get hurt by someone. Who doesn't feel the same way? She had actually tried. She had written that email and sent it and then waited, and I had been buried in my own ambition to even open it. to even notice she was waiting, to even register that she had been about to say the thing that would have changed everything. Gary called at 10 p.m. He asked if I had figured anything out. I told him I needed to call him back. He said that meant yes. I said goodnight. He said he was going to need details eventually. I called Mia. It rang 4 times and I was already planning what to say to her voicemail when she picked up. Background noise. She was somewhere with people and music and noise. She said my name in a voice that was carefully neutral in the way that something is carefully neutral when it is working to be neutral, instead of just being it naturally. I said, I found the emails. All 3 of them. I found the 3rd one. There was a pause on her end that told me she knew exactly which email I meant, without me describing it further. She said, Kai, just my name. The way you say someone's name when you have said it differently in your head for a long time, and the real version lands differently than expected. I said, I didn't read it. I was in the middle of the launch and I missed it. I missed all 3 of them. And then I sent you the follow-up like they hadn't existed. She was quiet. I could hear the background noise of wherever she was becoming slightly more distant, like she had moved away from people to take this call somewhere more private. I said, I'm sorry. I know that's 10 years late. I know what that changes and what it doesn't change. But I needed you to know I didn't see it. I didn't choose to ignore you. Another silence, longer. The kind of silence that has a lot of things moving around inside it that haven't decided whether to come out yet. She said, that doesn't fix the acquisition. I said I knew. She said, it doesn't change the board's position. I said I knew that too. She said, then why are you calling me? I said, because you deserve to know. Because you spent 10 years thinking I chose not to read what you wrote to me. And I didn't. I just wasn't paying attention to the right thing. She said nothing. Then she said, good night, Kai. Not cold, not warm, just real. The first completely real thing she had said to me since I had sat down across the boardroom table from her. I said goodnight. She ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet city dark and thought about the version of my life where I had opened that email. What it would have looked like. Then I stopped thinking about that version because it wasn't useful. And I had an actual present situation that required an actual plan. Gary called back at 11 that night and I told him everything from the beginning, including the 3rd email and what it said and how long I had not opened it. He was silent for a full minute. Then he summarized, she fell for you, wrote a letter, you ghosted her by accident, and she spent a decade building a financial cage around your company. I said yes. That was an accurate summary. He said, okay, I need a second. Wow. Then he was quiet again for another 20 seconds. He then said, so you understand that from her perspective this is completely rational behavior. I said I understood. He said, and you still want to remind her of who she used to be. I said yes. He said, because you're in love with her. Direct, no softening, no preamble, just the sentence sitting there in the air between us on a phone call at 11 p.m. He said, I've watched you make every major decision around her for years without once saying so. It's not a large word, it's a small and accurate one. I told Gary he was fired. He said he had been fired 9 times and his employment status remained unchanged. I said goodnight. He said, you're going to need a plan that doesn't involve just calling her. He was right. Calling her had been necessary, but it was not a strategy. And I needed a strategy because I had 2 weeks and a woman who had very good reasons not to trust a single thing I said. The next morning I did something that Gary described as either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, depending entirely on how it went. I sent Mia a message, not about the acquisition. I sent her the name of a restaurant we used to talk about in college, a specific place in the city that we had both mentioned in different emails over the years, as somewhere we wanted to go. I said, not about the deal, just dinner, if you want. And then I waited. Gary watched me wait. He did not say anything for approximately 2 hours, which was a record for Gary. She replied at 2 in the afternoon. One word, when. Gary read it over my shoulder. He said, I need you to know I remain opposed to all of this. I said, Thursday. She said, fine. Gary then spent the rest of the day telling me in significant detail everything that could go wrong with having dinner with the woman who was acquiring my company for personal reasons. He covered legal exposure, emotional exposure, the optics of an informal dinner during active acquisition negotiations, and the appearance of improper conduct. He also had a separate concern he described only as the general chaos of you and proximity to the specific human being. He was thorough. He always was. I listened to all of it. I genuinely appreciated all of it. I considered every single point he made carefully. And then I went to dinner on Thursday anyway. She was already there when I arrived. which I should have expected. Mia was never late to anything in her life. Being early was the minimum she considered acceptable for any event. She was wearing dark blue. She had a glass of water and she was reading something on her phone, and she looked up when I walked in with an expression that was doing several things at once. I sat down. A waiter appeared immediately. We ordered drinks. We looked at menus. To people in their 30s doing the extremely normal thing of sitting across a table from each other. Except one of us was in the process of acquiring the other's company, and the other one had accidentally ignored a confessional email for 6 weeks in college and derailed both their lives. Completely standard dinner, obviously. To people and a decade of unspoken things and a company acquisition sitting between the breadbaskets like an uninvited guest. She asked how my team was handling the uncertainty. I told her Gary was handling it by being constantly pessimistic, which was his factory setting regardless of circumstances. She almost smiled. There it was, the corner of her mouth. A fraction of the actual smile. The one I had seen 1,000 times in a classroom that smelled like chalk. I filed it away carefully. I asked her how Vertex Capital had actually started. Not the press version, the real version. She looked at me for a moment, deciding something. Then she told me. She had started it with her own savings and one outside investor who believed in the thesis before there was any evidence for it. 3 years of building before the first real fund closed. She had worked 18-hour days for 2 years straight. She had turned down 3 acquisition offers for Vertex itself before it had the power to make offers of its own. She told me this without any performance. No pride, no humility, just the facts of what had happened. The way you describe something to someone you believe is capable of understanding it. I realized somewhere in the middle of it that she hadn't talked to anyone about this version of the story in a very long time. Maybe ever. The public version was cleaner. This one was true. I said, "You built exactly what you said you wanted to build. Something that lasted." She looked at me. Then she looked at her glass. She said, "I did." Quiet, like confirming something to herself. I said, "I know I missed it. The email. I know what it cost. I'm not asking you to forgive that or pretend it didn't happen. I'm just asking if the person who wrote it is still in there somewhere." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "That person made a business decision based on available information and built accordingly." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "I know." We sat with that for a few seconds. Around us the restaurant moved the way restaurants move, full of people having their own separate conversations that were probably much simpler than ours. She asked why I hadn't fought, why I had come to the negotiation without the legal force she had clearly been prepared for. She said her team had expected a much more aggressive response. I told her I had considered it. For about 6 hours I had considered it seriously. And then I had decided that winning a legal fight against her was worth less to me than understanding why she started one. She looked at me in a way I remembered from a long time ago, like she was recalibrating something, like new data had arrived and she was working out where it changed the existing calculation. She said, "Gary must hate this." I said Gary had a ranked list of his objections and updated it daily. She said, "Smart man." I said, "Constantly. It's genuinely exhausting to be around." She laughed. "A real one. Brief. Quickly recovered, but real." And for one moment she looked exactly like the girl in 10th grade who laughed without apologizing for it. She caught herself doing it and looked away, and I did not say anything about it because I was not trying to push her. I was trying to remind her. There is a difference that matters. The dinner lasted 2 hours. We talked about the industry, about mutual contacts, about things that had nothing to do with acquisitions or old emails or anything that required careful handling. And then at the end, when the bill came and she reached for it the same moment I did, our hands landed on the small leather folder at the same time, and neither of us moved for a second. She looked up. I looked at her. About 3 feet of table and 10 years of everything between us. She pulled her hand back first, said she would cover it. I said thank you. Outside on the street she put on her coat, and her assistant appeared from somewhere nearby. The way assistants of powerful people always appear from somewhere nearby, ready and silent. She looked at me in the streetlight. Then she said, "The board meets in 10 days. Whatever you're doing, Kai, it needs to also make sense on paper. Sentiment doesn't win in a boardroom." I said, "I know. I'm working on it." She said, "Work faster." And she walked to her car and got in, and the door closed and the car moved, and the street went back to being a regular street. I stood there for a moment in the cold. Then I called Gary. He picked up immediately. He said, "How bad?" I said. She laughed twice. He was quiet. Then he said, "Okay, that's actually something." I said, "I need a counterproposal. Something that changes the shape of this deal." Something that makes sense financially and also isn't me just handing her my company. Gary said, so a merger structure, not acquisition. Equal standing boards. Shared operational control would define lanes. I said that was exactly the direction. He said, I've already been sketching it. I paused on the phone, processing that. Then I said, you already started building this counter-proposal before I ever called you tonight. He said, you've been making decisions around her since high school. I learned to prepare for the version where you do something nobody expected, including you. I did not know what to say to that. Gary said, get some sleep. I'll have a first draft by morning. He ended the call, and I walked back to my car in the quiet city night. 10 days. I had 10 days to build a counter-proposal that could hold up in a boardroom and also somehow communicate something that boardrooms don't normally have space for. The 10 years of building in opposite directions have pointed both of us here, to this city, to this deal, to a restaurant with a leather bill folder, and to hands landing in the same place at the same moment. Gary's draft was sitting on my desk when I arrived at 7 the next morning. 18 pages, detailed, precise, and genuinely creative in its structure. He had found a way to combine both companies that protected Arden's operational identity while giving Vertex exactly the market access it had been after all along. It was, technically, a better outcome for both sides than the original acquisition. The numbers were stronger. The combined entity would be significantly larger than either company alone. I read it twice. It was good. It was very good. It solved the business problem almost completely. What it could not solve was the personal problem that had created the business problem. And I was beginning to understand, sitting at my desk with Gary's 18 pages, that those two problems were not actually separable. They never had been. Not since the third email. I called her assistant and scheduled a meeting. Not a negotiation. A working session. Just me and Mia. No legal teams. To look at an alternate structure before the board meeting. Her assistant called back within the hour. Mia had agreed. Same building. 3 days from now. Bring the proposal in whatever format worked for the presentation. Her assistant would confirm the room. Gary said she agreed within the hour. Which means she was already waiting to see if you do something other than show up with lawyers or roll over entirely. I said I thought so. He said, you're actually not bad at this when you're paying attention to the right things. I told Gary that was the nicest thing he had ever said to me. He told me not to make it weird. Then he asked if I needed him in the room for the working session. I thought about it. I said no. He said, right answer. This one's yours to carry. And he went back to his coffee and his permanent low-level skepticism and his 18 pages of very good work. 3 days later, I walked into a conference room in a building that Vertex Capital owned, and Mia was already there, alone, with 2 copies of what appeared to be the original acquisition documents. She looked up when I came in. No assistant, no legal team, just her, the documents, and the particular quality of attention she gave things she had decided were worth her full focus. I put Gary's proposal on the table. She picked it up and started reading, and I sat down and waited and did not say anything because she was reading and mere reading required silence. It took her 12 minutes. She read every page. She went back to page 7 and read a section again. Then she put it down and looked at it for a moment without looking at me. Then she said, this is a significantly better outcome for both entities than what was on the table. I said I knew. She said, Gary wrote this. I said Gary had started it. She raised an eyebrow. I said, the structure was his. The reason we're sitting here instead of in a courtroom is not his. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what is the reason, exactly? In plain language. I said, because you mattered more to me than being right. You always did. I just didn't know how to say it when we were 17, and I still wasn't great at it when I called you that night. She looked at me with the expression of someone receiving information they are not entirely sure what to do with. Not resistant, just careful. Like handling something that might be fragile. She said, if I accept this structure, I need to know you're not going to disappear again when something harder than a merger comes along. Not a business question. A real one. I said, I know, and I don't have a guarantee to give you. I just have the thing I should have said in every email I didn't send, and every call I let go to voicemail, and the one I actually did pick up. She looked at the proposal on the table, then at me, then at the window, then back at me, a full circuit of the room before landing back on the starting point. She said, I'm going to need Gary's financial modeling in full before I take this to my board. I said I'd have it sent by tomorrow morning. She said, and I'm going to want a meeting with your senior team. I said I'd set it up. She said, and I want the East Coast distribution network reframed as a shared asset from day one, not a transition item. I said that was reasonable. She said, I know it is. And then she did something that stopped me completely. She picked up the proposal, went to page 7, and circled a specific clause. Then she slid it back across the table with a pen. The circled section was the one about shared decision authority on major acquisitions. She had circled it and written two words in the margin. Her handwriting, exactly as I remembered it. She had written two words in the margin in her handwriting, small and clear, and completely deliberate, worked for me. Just that, nothing else needed. I looked at it, then I looked at her. She was already gathering the original acquisition documents into a neat stack without making a particular production of what had just happened. She said, I'll see you at the board meeting. She stood up. She picked up her documents. She walked toward the door with the same precision she had walked into every room I had ever seen her enter. At the door she paused. She didn't turn all the way around. Just enough. She said, Kai. I said yes. She said, for what it's worth, I would have said yes. To the email. 10 years ago. She walked out. The door closed. I sat in the conference room alone with Gary's 18 pages and a circled clause and two words in handwriting I recognized from 20 years of knowing her. I called Gary. He picked up on the first ring. I said, she wrote works for me on page 7. There was a long silence. Then Gary said, I need to sit down. I said, you're already sitting down. He said, then I need to sit down more. Another pause. Then, she said it would have been yes. I said she had. He was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, good. About Tom. I sat with that for a moment. About Tom. 10 years of building in parallel lines, one accidental silence, 14 months of careful strategy, and a pen circling a clause on page 7. The board meeting was in 7 days. The merger was not guaranteed yet. Her board still had to vote. My board still had to vote. There were numbers and structures and legal language still to work through. But something had shifted in the conference room that no amount of legal language was going to unshift. The door that had been closed for 10 years had been open more than 1 inch this time. I got up. I straightened the proposal. I picked up a copy she'd written on. I was going to keep that page. Not for evidence. Not for any boardroom reason. Just because of two words in familiar handwriting. Gary called back while I was still in the building, before I had even reached the elevator bank at the end of the hall. He said, are you smiling right now? I said no. He said, I can hear it in your voice. I said I was maintaining a professional demeanor. He said, sure you are. 100%. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. 7 days to a board meeting, a merger on the table, and a woman who had just confirmed something I had been trying to find a way back to for a decade. Gary was still on the phone. He said, for the record, I supported this from the beginning. I said, Gary, you told me it was the worst idea I'd ever had. He said, I said worst. I didn't say wrong. 7 days before a board meeting that was going to decide whether the companies became one or went back to being opponents with expensive lawyers and worse memories. 7 days. And I still wasn't entirely sure which outcome Mia actually wanted underneath the proposal. And the circled clause and the two words in familiar handwriting. Gary had printed page 7 and taped it to the wall of his office. He said it was for reference. I said it was because he was sentimental. He said those were not mutually exclusive things. I spent the first 2 days preparing the board presentation. Numbers, projections, combined market position. The specific advantages the merger created that neither company had alone. It was good work. Solid, defensible, the kind of thing that could sit in front of serious people and hold up under serious questions. Gary had built a strong foundation and I had built on it. But every time I sat back and looked at the full deck, I kept thinking about what Mia had said outside the restaurant. That whatever I was doing needed to make sense on paper. She was right, it did. The paper version was in excellent shape. The other version, the one that had started with a 3rd email in a college inbox, that one was still in progress. On day 3, I got a call from someone I hadn't expected. Not Mia. Not her attorneys. Her CFO, a sharp woman named Rachel Park, who said she was calling on a personal matter. Rachel said she had known Mia for 8 years. She said, I've watched her build Vertex from nothing and I've never once seen her make a decision that wasn't airtight and completely rational. Then she said, until this one. This acquisition has had a personal component from the beginning and I think you already know that and I think you should understand what you're working with. I asked her what she meant. She said, Mia doesn't make mistakes. But she almost made a serious one here because she let something old affect something new. You showing up changed the math. I said I appreciated her calling. She said, I'm not calling to help you. I'm calling because if this merger goes wrong because of something emotional on either side, it damages both companies. Then she said, fix it before the board meeting. Whatever is unresolved between the two of you, resolve it. The board will see it in the room if you don't. They always do. She hung up. I sat with that for a moment. Rachel Park had just told me, politely and in professional language, that the merger was being watched by people who could read a room, and that if Mia and I walked into the boardroom still carrying whatever we were carrying, everyone sitting around the table would feel it before the first slide came up on the screen. Gary had overheard my side of the conversation. He came in without knocking. He said, Rachel Park called you. I said yes. He said, she called me an hour ago too. I stared at him. He said, she said the same thing to me that she said to you, I assume. She said the emotional variable is the only one that isn't solved yet, and it's the one that can sink everything. I said, and what did you tell her? He said, I told her that the emotional variable had been unsolved for approximately a decade and that I had been the only one paying attention to it. He then said, I also told her that you were better at this than you appeared, which is the most generous assessment I have given any situation you've been personally involved in. I asked Gary what he actually thought I should do. He sat down. He looked at the page 7 printout on his wall. He said, talk to her. Not about the deal, about the actual thing. I said we'd had dinner. We'd had the phone call. We'd had the working session. He said, those were all useful. None of them were the conversation. You know what the conversation is. He was right. I knew exactly what it was. It was the conversation that started with that third email and ended with something that had never been said out loud by either of us in any room. I called Mia that evening. She picked up on the third ring this time. I said, I need to see you. Not about the board meeting. Not about the proposal. Something else. There was a pause. She said, when? I said, tomorrow morning, if you're available. Somewhere that isn't a conference room. Another pause. Then, there's a place near the river. I'll send the address. She sent it 5 minutes later. No message attached. Just an address and a time, 8 a.m. I told Gary. He said, good. Just that. Not what, not how. Just good. Coming from Gary, that was enormous. I didn't sleep particularly well. I lay in the dark running sentences in my head, testing them, deciding they were wrong, starting over. At 3 a.m. I stopped trying to prepare and just lay there. The truth was I didn't need sentences. I knew what I wanted to say. I'd known since I found the third email, since the pause on the phone, since her hand landed on the same folder as mine. The place she had sent the address for was a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the river. The kind of place that opened early and had tables by the window and didn't play music too loud. She was already there. Of course she was. She had a coffee in front of her, and she was looking out the window at the street, and she turned when I came in with an expression I couldn't quite read. I got coffee. I sat down across from her. The table was small, significantly smaller than a boardroom table, which felt like the correct adjustment for what we were actually here to do. She said, you look like you didn't sleep. I said, I didn't particularly. She said, neither did I. I said, good. That means we're both going to say the thing we actually mean today. The corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile. The fraction. I had started cataloging those fractions because they were the only version of her that was fully unguarded. I said, I want to tell you what happened from my side. The real version. Not the apology version I gave you on the phone. The actual account of what I was thinking and what I missed. She looked at her coffee, then at me. Then she said, okay. One word. But she said it the way you say something when you've been waiting for it and are slightly afraid of receiving it. I said that in the fall of our senior year I had been in the middle of launching a product that failed 3 months later. I was working every available hour and barely sleeping. I said the emails had come in during the worst 2 weeks of the period. I had seen them arrive and flagged them to read later, and then later had kept moving further away because that's what later does. I said, when I saw the third one I thought I'd already read the first 2. I thought it was a follow-up to a conversation I'd already responded to. I sent you a catch-up email and moved on. She was very still. I said, I'm not telling you that to remove my responsibility for it. I'm telling you because I need you to know it wasn't a choice. I wasn't looking at those emails and deciding. She looked at the table. She said, I waited 3 months before I accepted that you weren't going to answer. I said, I know. I worked it out from the timestamps. She looked up. I said, you wrote that email in March. I sent the catch-up in April. You didn't reply. By July, you had started redirecting our conversations to purely professional topics. By September, they stopped. She said, You went back and dated it. Not a question. I said, I needed to understand the full shape of what happened. I couldn't do that from memory alone. She was quiet. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, I told myself it was a decision, that you'd read it and decided not to respond, and that was your answer, and I needed to move forward with that. She said, it was easier the way. A decision I could be angry about. A choice that was clear. Something I could build around instead of something I couldn't explain or put anywhere. I said, and then you built Vertex. She looked at her coffee. And then I built Vertex. She said it the way you say something when you're hearing it clearly for the first time, even though you already knew it. She said, Rachel called you. I said yes. She closed her eyes briefly. I said, she called Gary too. She said, of course she did. Then, Rachel has a very specific definition of helpful. I said, she wasn't wrong. Mia said, she's never wrong. That's the most exhausting thing about her. I said, she said the board will see it in the room if it's not resolved. Mia looked at me, and is it resolved? I said, I don't know. That depends on something I haven't said yet and something you haven't said yet, and whether this table is the right place for both. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, say it. No preamble, no softening. The same directness she used to solve problems on a classroom board when we were 11 years old. I said, I have been in love with you since the 10th grade. I never said it at 17 because I was terrified. I said, then I was 20 and buried in work. Then 30, and you were dismantling my company. The timing has been consistently terrible. I said, the timing has been consistently terrible, but the thing itself has been completely consistent, and I think you should know that before we walk into any boardroom together. She looked at me for a long moment. The coffee shop moved around us. Someone ordered something at the counter. A door opened and closed. The street outside continued being the street. She said, I wrote that email because I was 22 and I had figured out that the only thing I was actually afraid of was saying it out loud to you and being wrong about what you felt. She said, I thought if I said it and you didn't feel the same, I would lose the one person I had told everything to since I was 11. And I decided that risk was worth taking. She said, and then you didn't answer. And I decided I had been wrong about what you felt and one billed accordingly. She looked at her coffee. The way I build everything, very thoroughly. I said, you weren't wrong. She looked up. I said, about what you thought I felt. You weren't wrong. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her coffee very carefully. She said, this is not a good time to be having this conversation. We have a board meeting in 4 days. I said, I know. She said, and a merger that 700 people depend on going correctly. I said, I know. She said, and Rachel is going to be insufferably pleased with herself if this works out. I said, genuinely unbearable. Yes. The corner of her mouth did the thing again. Then the fraction became a full smile. Brief. Real. The one that didn't apologize for itself. And for a second she looked exactly like the girl who had solved the board problem without looking proud. I said, 4 days. We have 4 days to be completely professional and solve the board meeting, and then we have the rest of whatever comes after that to figure out the rest. She looked at me. Then she said, the East Coast distribution reframing needs to be finalized before Thursday or my board will table the whole structure. I said I'd have it by Wednesday. She said, and the senior team meeting needs to happen before Friday. I said I'd confirm by end of day. She said, and you need to stop looking at me like that in any room where other people can see you. I said, like what? She said, like you found something you've been looking for. She picked up her coffee cup. It's very obvious and it will confuse the lawyers. I said, I'll work on it. She said, please do. But she was still almost smiling when she said it, and that was a different kind of answer than the words. We left the coffee shop together and stood on the pavement for a moment in the early morning cold. Her driver was at the curb. My car was around the corner. She said, 4 days. I said, 4 days. She said, don't be late to the board meeting. I said I was never late. She gave me a look that communicated skepticism without requiring words. Then she walked to her car. Her driver opened the door. She got in. The door closed. The car pulled away into the morning traffic, and I stood on the pavement in the cold feeling something enormous. Gary called at 8:15. He said, how did it go? I said, we said it. He was silent. Then he said, both of you? I said, both of us. He exhaled for approximately 3 full seconds. He said, okay, good. Now forget it exists until after the board meeting and build me a finalized East Coast distribution model by Wednesday or none of this matters. I said, good morning to you too, Gary. He said, Wednesday, Kai. Wednesday. He ended the call. I walked to my car in the cold morning air feeling like the city looked slightly different than it had yesterday. Cities don't change because someone had a conversation in a coffee shop. That's not how cities work. But there is a quality to morning light when something heavy is no longer entirely yours to carry alone. The next 4 days were the busiest of my professional life and also somehow the clearest. I knew exactly what I was building and exactly why, and that combination produces a specific kind of focus. Wednesday came. The East Coast distribution model was done by noon. I sent it to Mia's team and got a reply from Rachel within 20 minutes that said only, "Better. Send the full deck by 6 p.m. I sent the full deck at 5:50. Rachel replied at 6:03. "Board is prepared. See you Friday." Gary printed that email and taped it next to page 7 on his wall. I chose not to comment. The senior team meeting happened Thursday. Mia came with 2 of her senior directors. My team sat across from her team in a conference room that felt appropriately serious for the occasion. She was completely professional, clear, prepared, direct in her questions and precise in her responses. The 2 teams talked numbers and structure and transition timelines for 2 hours straight. At no point did anyone in that room know that the person across the table had written me an email 22 years ago. An email that had changed the direction of both our lives by going unanswered for 6 weeks. In a college inbox. At no point did anyone notice that I was occasionally looking at her the way she had told me, not to look at her in rooms where other people could see me. Gary noticed. He kicked me twice. After the meeting, in the hallway, she stopped beside me while our teams gathered their things. She said very quietly, "Your operations director is excellent. Don't lose her in the transition." I said I had no intention of losing anyone. She said, "Good." Then she said, just as quietly, "You didn't look like you found something in there." "Well done." I said, "I practiced." She said, "I know. It showed." Then she turned away and walked toward the elevator with her team, which was the most efficient exit I had seen her make since the first negotiation. Then her team came out and she moved with them down the hallway, and I stood there for a moment before Gary appeared beside me and said, "For words, focus on tomorrow's meeting." I said, "I am focused." He said, "You are focused on the wrong thing." I said, "I'm focused on both things simultaneously." He said, "That is not the reassurance you think it is." Friday morning, the board meeting. I got there early, which Mia would later describe as unusual, and set up at the end of the table with Gary on my left and Art, the senior board members, on my right. Mia arrived at exactly the scheduled time, which was not early and not late, but precisely on time, which for her was a deliberate choice rather than an accident of traffic. She walked in with Rachel and 2 board members and sat across from us. The room settled into the specific geometry boardrooms take on when something significant is being decided and everyone already knows what it is. She did not look at me immediately. She looked at the room, at the presentation screen, at the documents in front of her. Then she looked at me and gave a brief, professional nod. I gave a brief, professional nod back. Gary made a very small sound beside me that only I could hear. I chose to interpret it as encouragement rather than whatever it actually was. The presentation ran 40 minutes. Larger rooms and bigger audiences. I had done those before, many times, and none of them had felt quite like this one. But presenting to someone who sees through polish is a different thing. Every single claim had to be completely true when she was the one across the table. Every number had to be real, not rounded up for presentation purposes. Every projection honest rather than optimistic. Every claim about combined market position had to survive the scrutiny of someone who had built her own version of exactly this business from a complete standing start. She asked 6 questions and every one was exactly what I would have asked from her position. Precise, aimed directly at the exact place where arguments break under pressure. She asked 6 questions, each one aimed precisely at the place where arguments break under pressure. She had found every structural ed before I had finished the relevant slide. I answered all 6. Gary had prepared me for 4 of them. The other 2 I answered from 12 years of running art and knowing exactly where its strengths and its edges were. When the presentation ended, her 2 board members consulted with each other quietly. Rachel looked at the financial model on her laptop. Mia looked at the document in front of her. Then she looked at me. Not the professional nod, not the careful neutral look she had been using since the first negotiation. Something closer to what I had seen at the coffee shop. She said, "The board will need 30 minutes to discuss privately." I said that was completely reasonable. Our teams cleared the room and went to separate areas in the building to wait. Gary and I stood by a window at the end of the hallway while the board discussed things privately. He had his coffee. I had the specific feeling that comes from doing everything correctly and then having no control at all over what the results of it will actually be. He said, "You did everything right in there." I said, "I know." He said, "The numbers are good." I said, "I know." He said, "She's going to say yes." I said, "I know." He said, "Then why do you look like that?" I said, "Because knowing something is right and waiting for confirmation that it worked are two completely different experiences, and the second one is significantly less comfortable than the first." Gary looked at his coffee. He said, "For what it's worth, I have been your right hand for 12 years and I have never once seen you build something you actually cared about that didn't hold." I said, "Thank you, Gary." And I meant it in a way that went considerably beyond the merger structure, though I did not specify that and he did not ask me to. He said, "Don't thank me. I still think this whole situation has been emotionally chaotic and professionally borderline." I said, "And yet you tape page 7 to your wall." He said nothing. 28 minutes after the room cleared, Rachel appeared at the end of the hallway. She walked toward us with a kind of measured pace that doesn't give anything away on purpose. She stopped in front of us. She said, "The board has reached a decision." She looked at me. Then she said, "Miss Chin would like you in the room. Just you. Not yet the full teams." Gary raised his eyebrows. I straightened my jacket and walked down the hallway, closing the last distance towards something that had been approaching from the opposite direction for a very long time and through a great many wrong turns. I pushed open the door. The boardroom was empty except for Mia, standing at the window on the far side of the room, looking out at the city the way she had looked at the street from the coffee shop. She heard me coming. She didn't turn immediately. I walked to the center of the room and waited. She turned around. She had the proposal in her hand. Page 7 was face up. She looked at me. Then she said, "The board approved the merger." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "Unanimous." I said, "That's good." She said, "Rachel voted first." She looked extremely pleased with herself. I said, "Insufferable." She said, "Completely." And then she set the proposal on the table and looked at me and said, "So, 700 people, 2 companies, and 1 board decision later." I said, "Yeah." She said, "The East Coast distribution structure goes live in 90 days. I said, "We'll be ready." She said, "The combined entity needs a name before the public announcement." I said, "We'll figure that out." She said, "We will. Not the companies, we?" She said we. I noted that. I was going to keep noting it for a while because it deserved to be noted. She walked toward me and stopped about 3 feet away, which was exactly the distance the table had been in the coffee shop. She said, "I'm choosing to believe the missed email was an accident." I said, "It was." She said, "I know. I've known since you called and told me. I just needed some time to let it replace the version of the story I had been living with." I said, "That's fair." She said, "It is." Then she said, "We're going to have to work together every day." I said, "I'm aware." She said, "It's going to be complicated." I said, "Probably." She looked at me with those precise eyes that had been sharp since she was 11 years old. Then she said, "Worth it though, I think." Just that, and she held my gaze long enough for it to mean something. I said, "Yeah, I think so too." I meant that in more ways than the sentence could hold, and I was fairly certain she understood exactly which ones. For the first time since all of it, the prospectus, the negotiation, the 3rd email, and the full decade sitting between it and this exact moment, I had the clear and certain sense that we were finally, actually, talking about the same thing at the same time. She said, "Don't be late to the integration kickoff on Monday." I said, "I'm never late." She gave me the look. I said, "I'll be early." She said, "That would be a first." I said, "People change." The corner of her mouth, the fraction, then the full version. Real, unguarded, exactly as I remembered it from every version of her I had been carrying around in my memory for 20 years. She picked up the proposal. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle and said without turning around, "Tell Gary I said well done on the structure." Then she opened the door and walked out into the hallway, back into the building that was about to stop belonging entirely to either one of us. I stood alone in the empty boardroom for a moment. The same city outside the window, same traffic, same light, same street below, and also entirely different in the specific way that only matters to the person who is standing inside the difference, feeling it from the inside. Gary was in the hallway. He looked at my face. He said, "Approved." I said, "Unanimous." He closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and said, "Mia says well done on the structure." He stared at me. He said, "She said that." I said yes. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "I've been saying that for 12 years about everything I've ever built for this company." I said, "She specifically said your name, Gary. Not my team, not the proposal. Your name." He looked at the hallway again and said nothing for a long moment. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Fine, I'll take it." He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the hallway where she had just walked. He said, "She's good, you know, actually good." I said I knew. He said, "This is either going to be the best thing that's ever happened to this company or the most complicated thing I've ever had to manage." I said, "Both, probably." He said, "Both. Yes, obviously both." He shook his head. Then he started walking toward the elevator. He said over his shoulder, "Monday morning, 7 a.m., integration kickoff." I said I'd be there. He said, "Early." I said I'd be early. He said, "I'll believe it when I see it." The elevator opened. He stepped in. The doors closed. I stood in the hallway in a building that Vertex Capital owned. And for days it would be a building that belonged to something that had a new name we hadn't decided yet. Something that was neither Ardent nor Vertex, but both of them and more than either. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there thinking about a classroom that smelled like chalk, about a third email and a college inbox, about two words in familiar handwriting on page 7 of a document that had started all of this. The version where I opened the email at 22, and the version where I didn't, and the version I was standing in now at 30, to where both routes had somehow arrived at exactly the same place. The elevator opened. I stepped in. The doors closed. I looked at the floor numbers counting down and thought, Monday, 7 a.m. early. For the first time in my adult life, being early to something felt like exactly the right thing to do. Like showing up was already the answer. Monday came the way Monday always comes when something important is about to start. Without ceremony, without fanfare. Just a regular morning that happens to be the first day of everything different. I was early. 6:58 a.m. I stood in the lobby of what was now officially a shared building and felt the specific strangeness of being early to something for the first time in my professional life. The security guard at the desk looked at me, looked at his screen, looked back at me with the expression of a man who had been told to expect someone but was still mildly surprised they'd actually arrived. He said, "Murdoch Kai." I said yes. He handed me a new access badge, different logo on it than the one I was used to. Not Ardent, not Vertex. Something new that the design team had finalized on Friday. I looked at the badge for a moment. Then I clipped it on and walked to the elevator. 43 floors up. The integration kickoff was already being set up by people who had gotten there before me. Gary was already there, of course, standing at the window with his coffee, looking at the city like a man reviewing a situation he has complicated feelings about and has decided to process through caffeine. He looked at me when I came in. He checked his watch. He said, 6:59. I said yes. He said, "You're a minute early." I said I had told him I would be. He said, "I'll need to see it twice before I believe it." Gary had watched me arrive late to everything for 12 years and had apparently decided this required evidence before updating his expectations. The room filled up over the next 40 minutes. My senior team on one side, Mia's senior team on the other. Then, gradually, the sides stopped making sense and people just sat where there was space. Rachel Park arrived at exactly the scheduled time and immediately began distributing documents with the efficiency of someone who Rachel had prepared for this moment significantly longer than anyone else in the building, which was visible in everything she did and said nothing about. She handed me my copy without comment. Then she handed Gary his. Then she moved on. Gary looked at the document. He said very quietly, "She terrifies me a little." I said, "I know. It's appropriate." Mia arrived at 7:58, 2 minutes early. She walked in, scanned the room the way she always scanned rooms, located the situation, and moved to the front without hesitating. She looked at me across the room. Brief, professional, the kind of look that contains a significant amount of information compressed into a very short amount of time. I gave a brief professional nod back. Gary made the small sound he made when he was choosing not to comment on something. I chose not to acknowledge it. We had a system and the system worked. The kickoff ran 2 hours. Both teams talking about integration timelines, technology infrastructure, client communication strategy, and the specific operational questions that these are the specific questions that arise when the companies that have been building separately for years suddenly have to build together, and they require actual answers rather than optimistic projections. I had been in 100 meetings like this in my career. None of them had felt like this one. Not because the content was different, because the person running the other side of it was different. Mia ran her half of the room the way she did everything. Precise, prepared, 3 moves ahead of wherever the conversation currently was. Her team followed at the same pace. The pace of people who had learned that keeping up was the minimum standard and falling behind was not an available option. My team followed me the same way, which I was aware of and was quietly grateful for, especially in a room where the stakes of how we showed up were considerably higher than a normal Monday. At the end of the 2 hours, Mia closed her notebook. She said the next integration touchpoint would be Thursday. She said the first joint client communication would go out Friday morning. Then she said, I want to acknowledge that this room contains the teams who built something worth protecting on both sides of this table. That doesn't go away in a merger. It gets combined. Her team absorbed this. My team absorbed this. Gary absorbed this in the particular way he absorbs things he approves of but will not say so about directly in any professional setting. She looked at the room. Then she said, Thursday at 9. Read sections 3 through 7 of the integration document before then. She picked up her notebook and walked out. Clean exit. Rachel gathered her documents. She passed me on the way out. She said, without stopping or making eye contact, better outcome than the original acquisition would have been. Then she was gone. I stood at the window after most people had cleared. Gary appeared beside me with a fresh coffee he had found somewhere. He looked at the city. I looked at the city. We stood there for a moment. He said, first day. I said, first day. He said, Thursday at 9, sections 3 through 7. I said I had already opened the document. He said, of course you have. He drank his coffee. I watched the city do what cities do in the morning, which is move without caring about anyone's particular Monday. Then Gary said, she's good in a room. I said, yes. He said, smart hire. I said, I didn't hire her. I merged with her. He said, same thing from where I'm standing. I said that was a significant oversimplification. He said, is it? I did not answer that because Gary was going to be right about this one, and he was going to know it, and there was no universe in which not confirming it out loud made it less true. The week moved fast. Every day had the particular momentum that comes when the organizations are running toward a shared deadline, and the deadline is real, and everyone knows what's at stake. I talked to Mia 3 times before Thursday, which was exactly as often as the work required and precisely as often as I would have found reasons to call regardless. Twice about the client communication language, once about a structural question that had come up in the integration document and needed a decision. Before it could move forward, all 3 conversations were completely professional, efficient, specific, useful. The kind of conversations you have when both people know exactly what they're doing and are doing it well. All 3 conversations also had a specific quality underneath the professional layer that I was aware of and that I was choosing to hold carefully until the professional layer had been properly established first. Gary noticed. He noticed everything. He said nothing, which was its own kind of comment, and I received it as such. Thursday came. Section 3 through 7 had been read by everyone. The meeting ran 90 minutes and was more productive than the Monday kickoff had been, because everyone had done the preparation. After the meeting, the teams dispersed. I stayed to talk through one remaining point with one of Mia's directors. When that finished, I looked up and the room was empty except for Mia, who was reviewing something at the far end of the table. She looked up when the director left. We were alone in the conference room for the first time since the boardroom, which had been the first time since the coffee shop, which had been. It was the first time since the negotiation, which had been the first time since the working session, which had been the first time since Chicago years ago when none of this had started yet. She said, good meeting. I said, good meeting. She said, Thursday is always better than Monday. I said, more data by Thursday. She said, more settled by Thursday. I said, also that. She closed the document she was reviewing. She did not immediately pick up her things to leave, which was information. Mia moved when she was ready to move and not before, and she was not moving. I said, are you free Friday evening? She looked at me. She said, that depends on what Friday evening involves. I said, dinner. Not about the integration. Not about sections 3 through 7. She looked at me for a moment, the same look she had given things her whole life when she was deciding something that required actual consideration rather than a quick calculation. She said, the joint client communication goes out Friday morning. I said, I know. I'm asking about Friday evening. She said, those are technically the same day. I said, they are. She looked at the document on the table. then at the window, then back at me, the full circuit. Then she said, 7. The place near the river. I said, I know the address. She said, I know you do. She picked up her things. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused. She did not quite turn around. She said, don't be late. I said, I won't be. She said, early, even. She walked out. I stood in the conference room with a specific feeling of someone who has just confirmed something they were already certain of but needed confirmed anyway. I called Gary. He picked up on the first ring. I said, Friday evening dinner. There was a pause. Then Gary said, not about section 3 through 7. I said, correct. He said, good. Then he said, for the record, this entire situation has been extremely stressful to manage from the outside. I said, I know. He said, I want credit for the structural proposal at some appropriate future point in time, preferably one where it cannot be dismissed as self-serving. I said, you already have me as credit for the structural proposal. She said your name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, fine. That's sufficient. Have a good dinner. He ended the call. I walked to the elevator. The new badge on my jacket caught the light as I pressed the button. Not Ardent, not Vertex. Something that had started as a problem and become something better. Friday morning, the client communication went out. Responses started coming in by noon. Positive, mostly. A few questions that the team handled before I had to get involved. The work was working. I left the office at 6:30. Gary watched me leave from his desk without comment. He raised his coffee cup slightly as I passed his door. That was Gary's version of have a good night and stay out of trouble. I had learned over 12 years to receive it as such and not ask for anything more expressive. The place near the river was the same. Same early evening light through the windows, same tables, same quiet quality that had made it feel like the right location for a conversation that needed to be real. She was already there when I arrived. Of course she was. Same dark blue she had worn to the coffee shop, different cut, and she was looking at the river through the window. She was looking at the river through the window when I came in, and she turned when the door opened, and her expression was the one I had been cataloging fractions of for weeks. Not a fraction this time. The full version of her expression. Unguarded, real. The one I had been cataloging pieces of for weeks and that didn't apologize for existing. She had decided something before I arrived, and it was visible in her face in the way. The decisions are when the person has stopped working to hide them. I sat down across from her. A waiter appeared. We ordered without looking at the menus because we had both been thinking about this evening, long enough to know what we wanted. That was the kind of evening it was going to be. She said, the communication went well. I said, yes. She said, the integration is on track. I said, yes. She said, Gary's. She said, Gary's structural proposal is holding up better than projected. I said, I'll tell him. She said, don't. He'll be insufferable. I said, too late. She said, don't. He'll become even more insufferable. I said, he already knows. She said, then don't confirm it. I said, too late. She almost laughed. The fraction appeared first, then the full version for a brief second, and then she recovered it back into something more professionally composed and looked at her glass. I said, I want to ask you something that is not about the integration. She said, I know. I said, you knew what I was going to ask. She said, I've known since the coffee shop. She said, I've known since the coffee shop what you were going to ask. I've been waiting for you to get the professional layer properly established first before you asked it. I said, was that obvious? She said, to me, not to anyone else. I said, you are doing the same thing. She looked at her glass. She said, yes. One word, clear, direct. I had missed that particular clarity for 10 years and a different kind of missing for 20. I said, I'm not going to be bad at this the way I was at 22. I can't promise I won't be difficult to work with because I think you already know the answer to that. She said, I already know the answer to that. I said, but I'm going to show up. Early, even. The corner of her mouth moved. Then the full version appeared without her recovering it and stayed there for a full second before she looked down at the table. She said, I spent 10 years building something specifically designed to force a confrontation with you, which is an unreasonable amount of effort for a personal matter. That is not entirely rational behavior. I said, no, not entirely. She said, it worked though. I said, exceptionally well, from where I'm sitting. She said, Rachel is going to be insufferable. I said, Rachel is going to be completely insufferable. She said, Gary is going to be. I said, Gary is going to be insufferable. She said, completely. I said, Gary already taped page 7 to his office wall as a reference document. She stared at me for a full second. She said, "He did." I said, "He called it a reference document." She said, "That is extremely Gary." I said, "It really is." And then we were both laughing, properly, at the same time, about the same thing, in the way that you laugh with someone when the thing you have been carrying together is no longer heavy enough to require careful handling. It lasted a few seconds. Then we were both looking at each other across the small table with the river out the window and the evening moving around us, and everything that had been complicated between us for 20 years was now sitting in the room without requiring active management for the first time since any of it had started. She reached across the small table and put her hand on top of mine, just for a moment. Then she picked up her glass. But the moment had happened and we both knew it had happened. And there was nothing to do with that information except let it be true. I said, 10 years. She said, 10 years. I said, we built to pretty good companies. She said, we did. I said, we'll build a better one. She looked at me. She said, we will. Not a business statement. Something else. The kind of thing that means several things at once and doesn't need to specify which ones. Because both people at the table already know. Outside the window, the river was doing what rivers do in the evening, moving without particular awareness of the two people sitting near it, who had arrived at the same place from opposite directions. Through a decade of wrong turns and one unopened email, the dinner lasted 3 hours. We talked about things that had nothing to do with integration timelines. We talked about her early years building Vertex, about my first failed startup, about the professors we had both hated and the ones we had both respected. We talked about the competition we had won in 8th grade and the one we had almost won in 9th, and the argument we had gotten into afterward that had we talked about the argument in 9th grade, that lasted 3 days and resolved itself without either of us directly admitting we had been wrong about any part of it. She said, you were wrong. I said, you were also wrong. She said, I was less wrong. I said, that is not a category. She said, it is now. I said, is this the merger talking? She said, this is me talking. The table was small. The conversation was large. Outside the window, the river moved through the evening indifferently. Inside, the people who had been building toward each other across the decades of excellent bad timing were finally, completely, in the same room. At the end of the evening, we walked out together. The street outside was cool, and the city was doing its evening version of itself, which is louder and brighter and more awake than the morning version. We stood on the pavement and she looked at me with the expression she had been wearing since she arrived and that I had been cataloging for too. The expression I had been cataloging fractions of for decades. The one that required no further cataloging because I was going to keep seeing it. Going forward, she said, Monday. I said, Monday. She said, integration review, 10 a.m. I said, I'll read sections 8 through 12 over the weekend. She said, I know you will. I said, you'll have read sections 8 through 12 twice by Sunday. She said, obviously. I said, I know. She said, good. Her driver was at the curb. She looked at me one more time before she turned. She said, Kai. I said yes. She said, I'm glad the email thing happened the way it did. I stared at her. She said, not the part where you missed it. The part where missing it made both of us build something worth combining. That part I'm choosing to read generously. I said, that's a very generous reading of a very significant mistake. She said, I'm choosing to read it generously. I said, since when? She said, since the coffee shop. She turned and walked to her car. Her driver opened the door. She got in. The door closed. The car pulled away. I stood on the pavement in the cool city evening and thought about a classroom that smelled like chalk and a girl who solved problems without looking proud. About a third email that sat unread in a college inbox while the person who sent it waited and eventually stopped waiting. About to companies that had been built in opposite directions for 10 years and had turned out to be building toward each other all along, without either of us planning it that way. About page 7 and Gary's wall and Rachel's version of helpful and the specific quality of morning light on a street after a conversation. That changes the shape of something. I stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then I called Gary. He picked up. I said, good dinner. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, good, finally. I said, finally. Gary was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, get some sleep. Monday at 10, sections 8 through 12. He said it without ceremony, the way he said everything that mattered. Monday at 10, integration review. You should read sections 8 through 12 before then. I said. She said the same thing. He said, then you should definitely do it. He paused. Then he said something he had never said to me in 12 years of being the person who told me when I was wrong about everything. He said, I'm glad it worked out, Kai. Actually glad. I said, thank you, Gary. Actually. He said, don't make it weird. That is a direct instruction. Then he ended the call before I could say anything that would have made it weird. I walked to my car in the cool evening with my new badge on my jacket and the specific feeling of a person who has finally figured out the thing they should have figured out 20 years ago. Not too late, just the right amount of late. The version of late that turns out to be exactly on time when you look at it from where you end up standing. I got in the car. I drove through the city that didn't know or care what had just finished and started on a street by a river. I drove through lights and traffic and the regular noise of a Friday night. And I thought, Monday. 10 a.m. Sections 8 through 12. A building with a new logo on the badge. 2 teams that were becoming one team. 1 boardroom that used to be a battlefield. And a woman who could solve any problem she decided to look at. Who had spent a decade looking at the wrong problem. Who had figured out the right one before I had the courage to say it out loud. I was going to be early on Monday. I was going to read sections 8 through 12 twice over the weekend and show up to every room that mattered and not disappear when something harder came along. I was going to show up to every room that mattered and not disappear when something harder than usual came along. Not because I had promised it, because she had said she was choosing to read things generously. And the least I could do with that generosity was make absolutely certain she never had to reconsider the choice. Gary called back 3 minutes later. He said, for the actual record. I supported this from the beginning. I said, Gary, you told me it was the worst idea you'd ever witnessed. He said, worst. Not wrong. I've been consistent. I said, good night, Gary. He said, read the sections. I said, I will. He said, Burley. I said, I know. He said, good. And then the line went quiet and the city kept moving and Monday was coming and I was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely ready for it.